Okay, so today I want to talk about coaching the sumo deadlift. So I think we all kind of know how to do sumo deadlifts, but coaching is another animal in and of itself. I think it's one of the trickiest lifts to coach. And I talked about it before, not everyone's a great fit for sumo. Definitely if sumo is the better option for you than conventional deadlifting, you're definitely in the minority. You're definitely an outlier. I think it's worth everybody trying it. And if somebody's not a great candidate for sumo deadlifting, they tend to weed themselves out pretty quickly due to anatomical variances. So first things first, we'll talk about, what about your anatomy makes you a good candidate for sumo deadlifts. Then what are some of the advantages of it? Like why would somebody want to do it compared to conventional? And then we'll talk about kind of the way that I like it to be coached to make sure that people are taking full advantage of the things that do make sumo deadlifts advantageous if you're the right person for it. So first things first, obviously with sumo, we're standing a lot wider than we would for a conventional deadlift. And the width that is right for every sumo deadlifter, again, is kind of individualized. But in order for sumo deadlift to, number one, fit your body, and number two, to be advantageous, you have to stand wide enough that it's going to cut down the range of motion quite a bit and allow your torso to stay pretty upright. Those are really the advantages compared to conventional. With conventional, we're standing a lot narrower, and because of that, we're going to have to be a lot more horizontal with our torso. So we have a nice long lever with our hamstrings, but the range of motion is a lot longer. When we get out wide like this, we keep our hips right on top of the bar. We can stay a lot more upright. It actually ends up being a shorter lever, so the moment arm, the distance between the hip joint and the bar itself, is going to be quite a bit shorter. So it's technically a less advantageous lever. If you think about if you were trying to pry open the garage door, if the garage door was stuck, would you rather use a long crowbar or a short crowbar? Longer crowbar is more mechanically advantageous. You have to move it through a further range of motion, but you don't have to apply as much force. That's kind of what conventional deadlifting is. Whereas sumo deadlifting, we keep our hips kind of right on top of the bar. We're going to stay much more upright, so it's a less mechanically advantageous lever. You just don't have to move the bar nearly as far. And for some people, that's a huge advantage. What about your anatomy makes you a good candidate for sumo deadlifting? You really need a lot of two things. You need a lot of hip external rotation, so rotating out this way, and you need a lot of abduction, abduction, so being able to move your legs away from your body. So a lot of that has to do with the actual structure of your hips, so the orientation of your pelvis, where your acetabulum, so your hip socket, where it sits relative to your pelvis, and then the angles of your femurs, so everybody's femurs kind of like, you have your femoral head, they go out like this and then out like that. The degree to which your femoral head goes out will kind of determine that as well. What's the best way to figure that out without assessing every single person and scouring their hips around? Have them try some sumo deadlifts. It feels really, really shitty if it feels really tight through the front of their hips or they're getting some sort of impingement, some pinching sensation in the front or the lateral part of their hip. Probably not a great idea to do it. So it's mostly going to be the bony anatomy that will make somebody a good candidate or not a good candidate for sumo deadlifting. Is there a muscular component to it? Absolutely. So when we stand wider in a sumo deadlift, it seems the research seems to indicate that the hip extensor demands are pretty much the same between conventional and sumo deadlifting. So the demands of your glutes and your hamstrings. The hamstring part has always sounded strange to me because of something called the length-tension relationship. So we understand that every muscle has a shortened position, every muscle has a lengthened position, and it's usually the midway point of those two positions where the muscle is the strongest. So for our hamstrings, if you think of a conventional deadlift, the place where we find hamstring tension is right about like mid-muscle length, right? So if we sit really, it's gonna be hard to demonstrate this, but if I sit really, really low into a deadlift and my hamstrings are very short, not a great position to produce a lot of force. If my hamstrings are very, very lengthened, absolutely I can feel hamstring tension, but this fully lengthened position is also not a great place to produce a lot of force. So there's a point along that length-tension relationship right about midway where I have a good amount of hamstring tension to be able to extend my hips. With sumo deadlifting, because you're out quite a bit wider and you're much more right on top of the bar, you're probably not going to get as much hamstring tension in a sumo position than you would a conventional position. So that length tension relationship has always sounded weird to me, like, oh, like the hamstring involvement's pretty much the same, but it is what it is. The big kicker is that you're going to get a lot more quads and a lot more adductors in your sumo position. And that makes a lot of sense because that moment arm for our hip extensors is a lot shorter. So we're going to rely a lot more on knee extensors, our quads. And also your adductor magnus is a big time secondary hip extensor. And when you put your feet out like so, same deal with the hamstrings in the conventional deadlift, we have our length tension relationship where our feet are really, really close together. Our hip abductors, our hip adductors are not necessarily lengthened at all. When we get out a little bit wider, those adductors are going to be in a little bit more lengthened position, somewhere closer to their midway point where they can produce a lot of force as hip extensors. On the flip side of that, if we go out super wide, and some people can do this, and I can do this, but I'm still a terrible sumo deadlifter, too much length in our adductors, right? So just because I can doesn't mean I should. I can make the range of motion really, really short on this, but if there's any appreciable weight on the bar, I'm not going to be able to put enough force into the ground to be able to lift any meaningful weight. But, you know, so the bony anatomy will usually make people a good choice or a bad choice for sumo deadlifting. And then the stance width is going to kind of be where can you both cut down the range of motion significantly and also put enough force into the ground to be able to actually break the bar off of the ground. So those are kind of the prerequisites for it. The way I like to coach the sumo deadlift is, you know, having people start with a more moderate stance first. And a good place for most people to start is somewhere right in between the ring and where the where the smooth part of the bar starts, somewhere right in there. If somebody's very, very small, a very, very short person, they're obviously going to probably want to start a little bit narrower. If somebody's quite tall or has very, very long legs, they may be able to go out a little bit wider, but that middle ground is usually a pretty good place to start. And then as far as toe position, you need to have your toes out enough that when you get in your starting position, your knee splits the middle of your foot. So this is very, very important to maintain this angle right here, because one of the advantages of sumo deadlifting is that you keep your hips right on top of the bar. If your knees go in at all, so if your hips go into adduction, then my hips are going to move backwards further away from the bar, therefore negating that close hip position that is an advantage of sumo deadlifting. So if you stand too wide and or turn your toes out too much, you may not be able to keep your knees even with the middle of your feet. You can see right here, if I drew a straight line from my hip joint through my knee joint, it's going to be inside my feet. If I just narrow my stance back to the original suggested starting point, now when I get in my ready position, I can keep those knees pushed outward. And that seems to be something that's a characteristic of very successful sumo deadlifters, is that they're able to just drive their knees out the whole time. You don't see a lot of successful sumo deadlifters complete a heavy sumo deadlift if the first move that happens is knees coming in and hips popping backwards. You know, those knees have to stay out in order for me to drive my hips forward and keep them close to the bar. So stance width will largely dictate that. Kind of the same thing with squats. It's like if somebody's knees are always snapping in when they squat, maybe they're standing too wide. You know, sometimes if the knees are so far out, there's nowhere for them to go but inward, because we know that hip extension and hip adduction and hip internal rotation all kind of go together. That's one of the reasons why sumo is kind of like never been my favorite, because it kind of goes against that whole idea that hip extension, adduction, and internal rotation ride together, and then hip external rotation and hip flexion all ride together, right? So sumo makes a lot of sense for getting into your ready position, but it doesn't make a ton of sense for driving up and going into hip extension. That's why it takes kind of some special anatomy to be able to preserve this position. You know, if your hips are very externally rotated as you're neutral, it's a bit easier to keep those knees out as you extend your hips. So stance width, just kind of that middle ground, making sure that your toes are oriented in a way that your knees can stay in the middle of your feet. Then as far as getting into position, this is where I think sumo has probably less wiggle room for individual interpretation than conventional deadlifting. You know, so if we're doing a conventional deadlift, we kind of have two options. We have like our top-down approach, where we, you know, carefully hinge our hips and get into position with our back already flat and our hips already exactly where we want them. Or we have more of a bottoms-up approach, where we just bend over and grab the bar with high hips and a rounded back, take the slack out of the bar, then dip into the position and flatten our back. Either one of those work. And in fact, I think the bottoms-up one is probably the better one. You tend to see most really, really good deadlifters do the bottoms-up approach. With sumo, I don't think the bottoms-up approach works very well. There are some people who use it, but especially when we're coaching it in here to people who are new to it, I think the bottoms-up approach is very, very, very hard to organize the right way. So that said, I much prefer for sumo a top-down approach. So we set our feet, we get our hips really, really close to the bar. You know, the cliche is like, keep your nuts right on top of the bar. If you know your client well enough and you know they won't be offended by that, by all means, use that cue. And then instead of rounding over and then dipping into position, I think it's a good idea to try to stay as upright as you can the whole time and focus on just dropping your hips straight down, pushing your knees straight out, and then by the time your hands get to the bar, you should be right in your ideal position. And what is your ideal position? Hips as close to the bar as possible, and therefore as high as possible. So we don't want to sit our butt way down. We want to keep our hips very, very high. And then also armpits right on top of the bar. When we set up this close to the bar, if we do a bottoms-up approach, my shoulders are so far in front of the bar that it's going to be really, really challenging to sufficiently get my shoulders right back on top of the bar without sitting down and back too much. You know, so we either will, what I tend to see for sumo deadlifters who do a bottoms-up approach is that they either don't finish their setup, you know, so they leave themselves out in front of the bar too much, it's still too rounded over, or they swing the pendulum all the way the other way, and in order to try to get their shoulders back on top of the bar, they just squat down too much, and then they get separated from the bar. Sometimes it's because they don't take the slack out. Sometimes it's because their shins push into the bar. I see that a lot with sumo deadlifting. That as people go to get in position, instead of driving their knees out and dropping their hips straight down, they do this. They push the bar away with their shins. You know, so there's really no room for anything except for a vertical shin in a sumo deadlift. Conventional, it's very much open to interpretation. You know, if you're a shorter lifter like me with short arms, you sit up further away from the bar and you allow for more shin angle. If you have somebody who's got very, very long arms and they can start right up against the bar, then maybe they'll have perfectly vertical shins. With sumo, vertical shins are pretty much a necessity. Something I really liked that I saw a long time ago, Joe Sullivan talked about like building the house. If you look at a sumo deadlift from the front, you know, it should look like the walls of the house, and then your upper legs should form the roof of the house. Whereas, you know, if I'm pushing the bar forward and my knees are going in, that's not a house shape. My house shape comes from this right here, having vertical shins and hips well above the knees. So definitely if you're working with somebody new to sumo deadlifting, try the top-down approach first. If that doesn't work, they may just not be a good candidate for sumo. Bottoms up can work. I haven't seen it work very well for anybody in our community. So top-down approach, as soon as my hands hit the bar, slack comes out, not by bending the elbows, but by trying to get the shoulders up and behind the bar. You don't actually want your shoulders behind the bar. You want your shoulders right on top of the bar. But if you take the slack out sufficiently, you shouldn't actually be able to get behind the bar without the bar actually coming off the ground. You know, so right here, my shoulders are directly on top of the bar. And as I start to pull the slack out and pull my chest up and back, if the weight's light enough, it's just going to start to come off the ground. So that's why I also don't love a counter movement in a sumo deadlift, because I'm all just trying to create all this tension right here and get in the right starting position. And what you'll see a lot of people do is they'll get in this good position, but then they'll give it up in order to do a counter movement, hips up, hips down, bonk the bar away from them. Just too many moving parts. It's where conventional can have all the moving parts ahead of it. You can do your counter movement. You can be really aggressive with like shaking the bar, grabbing the slack out. Sumo deadlift has to be calm, calculated, super tight. And once you've practiced that a ton and gotten really, really good at it, then you can perhaps start to add more moving pieces around it, like a counter movement. I hate the bar roll, but some people do the bar roll, is what it is. But to recap, you get your stance. You stay right on top of the bar. Knees go out. As soon as your hands get to the bar, this is your starting position. Slack out and get behind the bar. And then as you navigate the upward part of the lift, there's very much going to be what we call a two-part lockout. In conventional, the lockout often ends up in two pieces as well, but in a perfect world, it ends up a bit more simultaneous. Sumo deadlift is by design a two-part lockout. You know, so it's not like a kettlebell swing where hips and knees are going to lock together, or like an RDL. And you will see that in conventional sometimes. But sumo, you really do have to lock out in two separate pieces. It's always going to be knees first and then hips, not vice versa. So I'm in my ready position. And once I get the bar above my knees, I should very much want to snap my knees locked first and then push my hips through. If I do it in the opposite order, so if I'm doing a sumo deadlift and my knees are still bent when the bar gets above my knees, I'm in deep shit. And the reason for that is exactly what we talked about earlier. The moment arm for our hip extensors is very short. And you've probably seen some sumo deadlifters do this, maybe you've experienced it personally, where you're like inches away from lockout and you just can't lock it out. You just can't get your hips through. It's like, what the fuck? What's going on? Even though your hips are so close, again, a short lever is not a very mechanically advantageous lever. So, for that reason, if my knees are already locked, that I actually have some leverage to be able to push my hips through, versus if I get above the knee and my knees are still bent and I'm trying to push my hips through. Obviously, this is a hitch or a ramp or whatever you want to call it. Not allowed in powerlifting. So, that's where I'm going to talk about some of my favorite teaching tools for the sumo deadlift. But doing pause deadlifts actually right above the knee for a sumo deadlifter, I think makes a ton of sense because it kind of gets that sequence of the two-part lockout. So once I'm above the knee, make sure my knees are locked, stop for a second, bang, and then smash the hips through. And it looks a little silly because it's so short at the end. But man, if a sumo deadlifter gets the bar off the ground, they're probably going to have that sticking point right at lockout. You know, it's not like conventional deadlift where you're going to probably break. Most conventional deadlifters are going to be able to at least break the bar off the ground, and they'll probably miss mid-shin right below the knee. You very often see the sumo deadlifters either get stapled right to the floor, like the bar doesn't budge at all, usually because of some loss of position this way. Or if they break it off the ground, they tend to have that very, very high sticking point because of the poor timing of the sequencing of the knees locked and then hips locked. If you're a sumo deadlifter doing multiple reps per set, I think sumo deadlifting has the biggest, it's most useful during sumo deadlifts to do a light touch and go rather than resetting each rep. Conventional deadlifting, I'm not a big fan of touch and go reps whatsoever. I think any rep after the first one gets less and less productive because the starting position changes so much. On sumo deadlift, I actually think it's incredibly hard to keep a good starting position if you reset every rep. So once you do your first one, you develop all that tension, then I think it's a really good idea to use a controlled eccentric tap and go right into the next one. And that's actually going to give you a lot of good feedback about where your hips should be and how to load up your hips and hamstrings by pushing your knees out. Because that's really hard to do. It's very easy to load up your hips and hamstrings in a conventional position. You just do an RDL. You'll find your hamstrings no problem. When your stance is a little bit wider, it's a little bit harder to feel like you're tight and tense and ready to go. So that's where I think a touch and go deadlift, sumo deadlift, makes a lot of sense. So that already kind of covers some of the ways I like to teach the sumo deadlift, is using those slow eccentrics and a light touch and go. Kind of helps people understand where their hips should be and how to find tension in their lower half. The pause deadlifts above the knee make a lot of sense to me. teaching you to lock out your knees first and then your hips. And then probably my favorite one of all is the seated sumo deadlift, which I know you guys have seen before. I'm going to grab a box from over in the corner. So any sort of box or bench will work as long as it's high enough. And that's really the most important thing here, is that you use a box that matches the person's ideal hip height in their starting position. I'm short enough where an 18-inch box will work, but for most taller people, they would probably need something like a 21-inch box or something like that. A shorter person might need a little bit lower box. But the seated sumo deadlift is really good because it fixes your hips in one spot. You cannot sit your hips too low. You have to initiate the lift by creating tension into the bar with your torso. So it teaches you to take the slack out of the bar, not by dipping your hips lower, not by bending your elbows, but by creating all that thoracic extension, which is really, really important for sumo deadlift success. You see most of the best conventional deadlifters in the world deadlift with a relaxed upper back, relaxed shoulders. You don't really see that in sumo. If you do see somebody deadlifting at a high level with sumo and a relaxed shoulder position, you still look from the side and their armpits are still going to be right over top of the bar. Versus a good conventional, a world-class conventional deadlifter may actually be out in front of the bar a little bit. Pretty unlikely, but kind of the cliche remains that sumo deadlifting just has so little forgiveness for technical errors. So this is a drill I like a lot to dial that in. So you make sure that the hip height is right for the person. So hips above the knees. If you look from the front, still building the house. Vertical shins with the roof going up into the groin. And then when you grab the bar, you take the slack out. You sit up as tall as you can, trying to get the bar to go as high as possible. And then you stand up off the box. What you don't want to do, and the error that you'll see most people make right away, is they'll go to bring the bar off of the box, and instead of sitting up and back, their first move will be to start to stand up off the box. And they'll get tossed forward because they're not able to create that. They're not creating that tension through their upper body. They're just trying to push into the ground, which is the right idea. We use that cue a lot in deadlifting, push the ground away. But you have to take the slack out via thoracic extension first. So slack out, sit up and back, boom, then go. You want to talk about another drill that does well to teach that two-part lockout? On a sumo deadlift, if you don't lock your knees out, on a seated sumo deadlift, if you don't lock your knees out before your hips, man, it's going to feel wonky, right? You're going to come forward. Everything's going to pitch forward, forward, forward. So it gives really, really good feedback about keeping your hips in the right spot, using enough upper body tension to take the slack out of the bar, and then that sequencing of knees and then hips. I imagine in the near future, we're going to have a lot of people moving over to straight bar deadlifts. You know, even just recently, we've had a pretty good influx of new people, and a lot of them are just knocking out that deadlift prerequisite right away and moving to the trap bar. And I tell all of them when they move to the trap bar, it's like, okay, here you are. Here's where you need to be to move to straight bar deadlifts. When you move to straight bar deadlifts, we will try both conventional and sumo. So if you guys encounter somebody for the first time doing their straight bar deadlifts, I would definitely recommend having them try both and utilize some of these coaching cues in here. They're going to be very, very familiar with the conventional style technique because you stand narrow with a trap bar deadlift. But I mean, use your coach's eye to kind of see whether there's somebody who looks like they may be a good option for sumo deadlifting. Something I meant to say earlier too, outside of the actual hip structure and hip anatomy, I think leverage-wise, I think if you have short arms, you're going to suck at both deadlifts. If you have long arms, you're going to be good at both styles of deadlift. But in general, people who have short torsos and very, very long legs will probably be good candidates for sumo deadlifts. And the main reason for that is that if you have really, really long legs, it's going to extend the range of motion. But if you have a short torso, it's going to be easier to keep yourself right on top of the bar with your shoulders right on top of the bar. That's something that people who are built like me with short legs and long torsos, I think part of that is also their disadvantage in the deadlift, not just from the short arms part, But if somebody with a longer torso relative to the rest of their body gets like way over top of the bar, it's just that much more exaggerated. It's that much more of your body in the wrong position versus somebody who's got a short torso and long legs. Even if they are out in front of the bar, there's not that much of them out in front of the bar, if that makes sense. So if you see somebody who's built like Wendy, super long legs, short torso, there would be another reason to give sumo a shot. They're probably built to handle it pretty well. But yeah, when teaching somebody for the first time, make sure their stance width and their toe angle is matched so that they line up the right way. Start with a top-down approach. Really try to hammer that home. It's a little bit tricky, right, because it's hard to keep everything upright and right on top of the bar. But if people can't get the hang of a top-down setup, then sumo is probably not right for them anyways. And then finally, making sure they understand how to take the slack out of the bar by creating thoracic extension. And that's where something like a seated sumo deadlift is a great option. Band-distracted deadlifts would be a good option too. Anything that just emphasizes creating tension and taking the slack out of the bar by lifting the chest and not by dropping the hips down lower. All right, did I miss anything? Cool, all right, that's how I would like to see people coach sumo deadlift. Whew.